Good evening. Good evening,
Okay.
Parthasar.
Yeah.
How are you doing?
Fine. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, but little faint.
एक minute. Okay. Better?
Better.
Okay.
Sri Lankan crisis, former ambassador, Sri Lanka, a great thinker, a man with unparalleled and unprecedented experience. Sri Lankan matters and authority, probably better than most in the world. Parthasarthi sir would be taking us through the historical significance of Sri Lanka and India relationships. Those civil war years in the Sri Lankan crisis, especially the LTT liberation, because that time also he was part of the entire process in the Rajiv Gandhi regime. And then now, how it has unfolded and taken a totally different turn. And it's very, very significant from the Indian perspective, considering the entire global order, as far as India is concerned, with its neighboring nations of Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, that is Myanmar, Burma, Bhutan, Nepal, Pakistan, and China, India is not in a very, very enviable position. Sri Lankan crisis, in all its, what do you call, highs and lows today, has a remarkable bearing on the outcome of India's economic, social, political, global scenario. Parthasarthi sir, take us through the years, the tumultuous years of Sri Lankan crisis, and then now the political crisis, the reasons behind it, the future, and what exactly is uh, the reason why this crisis has unfolded now politically. No better person than you. Thank you for joining us. Over to you, G. Parthasarthi.
Well, I think as far as I'm concerned, I was started dealing with Sri Lanka in the 1980s when the Indian peacekeeping force was stationed there as the spokesman of the Prime Minister. And at that point in time, the focus was entirely on the ethnic and Tamil issue. And we did have a presence there, but we did negotiate an agreement which provided for a certain measure of autonomy for the Tamils. And so that was a beginning to put the Tamil issue aside. But ultimately, I would go to the extent of saying that in that time we found the Sri Lankans more reasonable than Velupillai Prabhakaran of the LTTE. Um, he was a man who couldn't accept democracy, lived and died by the gun, uh, ultimately killed by the Sri Lankans. But what I have subsequently noticed is that that ethnic crisis is now dying down. India assisted massively in the rehabilitation and assistance to Tamils. Two categories of Tamils: the Jaffna Tamils, who have been there for centuries, and the Indian Tamils, as they are called, who went there in the 19th century. We have provided housing assistance to them. We've provided more or less assistance in education and other areas, which have enabled the Tamils to get a better life. And in fact, the important factor is that the Tamil issue is no longer as important in Sri Lanka or as salient as their own development. The Tamils have integrated into Sri Lankan society and Sinhala society. Yes, there are problems, but there will be problems. But India did help in bringing them together. And the massive aid, rehabilitation, assistance we provided to the Tamils made it very clear that, especially to people in Tamil Nadu, that we do care much the way that they do in Tamil Nadu for the welfare of Tamils in Sri Lanka. So right now we are well behind that. The foreign policy problem for many years was that we were worried about Sri Lanka becoming a foreign military base for the Americans and their growing relations with China. The Americans have not expressed much of an interest or provided much aid. But the real risk we have now is China. China has absolute control of a strategic port, the Hambantota port and the airfield nearby, both in southern Sri Lanka and located along the routes of shipping across the Indian Ocean. So China is the major factor as we see it. It also had tried to take over completely management of the port of Colombo. They had a certain amount of say in it, a certain portion they got, and the port we found that not too comfortable with that because a huge amount of our shipping from the west comes through Sri Lanka, and there is transshipment in Colombo, and we couldn't afford to have the Chinese there. And right now, after a lot of negotiations, we have the Modi government has worked out an agreement whereby the residual portion of Colombo port will be managed together with us, and that we will ensure, because even we have military cargo coming through that way, that we move it through areas where the Chinese are not snooping around. So strategically we have achieved that. The Tamil problem, as I said, is now hopefully behind us. The Tamils are doing very well. In fact, they remain quite prosperous in Jaffna, and they have links with Singapore and other parts of Southeast Asia. So the problem now really boils down to the regime itself in Colombo. The this the Rajapaksha family, which now has ruled Sri Lanka for a pretty long length of time, or through a long time. They initially were pre-anti-Indian. They became very close to the Chinese. They found that the Chinese were giving them what they wanted. But then they also discovered that the Chinese assistance was really leading them into a debt trap, in the sense that it was becoming more affordable than they can, unaffordable, because of the amounts they had to pay. And Chinese credits, unlike the World Bank or IMF, are pretty well near commercial terms. So there has been a rethink on China, and therefore we found that that sort of money we will have to get others to join us to provide to match the Chinese. And Prime Minister Abe, who died recently, joined us in agreeing to finance the port project, which would ensure that China does not have exclusive control of Colombo port. So our relations with Sri Lanka have been improving. The Tamil issue has been largely subsumed, but it will always exist. Uh, and we have moved in at a situation now when things are pretty difficult, because the Rajapaksha government, it was the family. The eldest brother was prime minister. The second brother, who had already been prime minister, was made the president, and we had another two members of the family in the cabinet, and therefore I think that is the issue today. The discontent of the people of Sri Lanka with the government, and I mean the remarkable agitation which I've never seen the likes of recently. We saw the peaceful, but it was virtually the entire population of Sri Lanka moving in to take over areas, including the residences of the president and prime minister. That was really peaceful and effective. Um, the president has left. He went to Maldives and is now in Singapore. I'm not sure he would be welcome in Sri Lanka, Singapore for quite a length of time. But he does have, I think, a green card, used to have a green card at least, and a link with American citizenship. So the Americans, I doubt if they will accept him. But I think you're going to have presidential elections pretty soon, perhaps next week. The candidates would most likely be uh, the present Prime Minister, who is very close to the Rajapaksa regime. It's also Sajid Premadasa, who's son of former Prime Minister Premadasa, and two others. So it will be a close election. The present Prime Minister is a very astute politician, and we will Ranil Wickramasinghe. He's has a long experience in politics, and very frankly, now we're staying out of their internal affairs. It's theirs. The whether it is Ranil Wickramasinghe who wins, or if it is Mr. Premadasa, India will be quite comfortable, and I think we can go ahead with where we left out. The Chinese are sulking because they never expected an Indian return, and that too peacefully and politically in these circumstances. And the very fact that the agreements we signed were with the Rajapaksa government, which was earlier regarded as very pro-Chinese. So it's a credit to the success of the diplomacy of Mr. Modi, Jaishankar and others. And Jaishankar has served in Sri Lanka, that we have able to move to this place.
Future going forward, economic situation has been one of the major reasons why this kind of crisis has unfolded as well. And Chinese are obviously, we are no stranger to the Chinese policies with respect to economic, kind of, stepping in economically in these kind of regions, especially when it comes to India. In the future, how do you see this impacting the crisis, and how can India play a role in trying to neutralize this, Chinese incursion economically, politically, that's been happening in Sri Lanka over the last probably a decade or so, especially? How do you think India can counter these problems?
Well, with a larger economic involvement in Sri Lanka, for example, we can have power stations which we are now got the contract for, providing electricity through the sea pipelines in power projects in northern Sri Lanka and in the islands also. So, and also the fact is we have Japanese funding. Finally, the Chinese have thrown up their hands and they've done nothing to help Sri Lanka out of this crisis. Their aim has been very clear. They have got a port now, which they have virtually taken over, which the Sri Lankans could not afford to pay in Hambantota, and they will use that for influence in the Indian Ocean region, and that is going to be a continuing challenge. And the interesting point is that for finances, China is providing zero, and they've had to go to the IMF for funding. Sadly, they made some mistakes. I think the Rajapaksa family was less than wise when they stopped using fertilizers, and that really hit their agricultural production. I hope that that sort of, if I may say, mistake is not repeated, and it won't be now because they learned their lessons. Otherwise, Sri Lanka was thriving pretty well, doing economically, very high rates of literacy, learning, and by after in the last few years, especially now during after Mr. Modi took over, and you have a foreign minister in Jaishankar who has served there, lived there, and understands the Sri Lankans. I think we're in a much better position to handle it. Uh, the Sri Lankan military still comes for training to India. I think that should be expanded. Uh, I don't think they are Chinese will now be able to recover complete lost ground, but I must tell you that they are investing a lot in the transportation industry and in other areas which will be of benefit. So, China will always seek a presence in Sri Lanka. It's vital for them because it is lies on the access route crossing India to the Africa, and the entire oil supplies of this region come through just south of the Hambantota port. So it's not just India. That's why the Quad has to get into it, and we will be assessing how the Chinese grow there. But I think now we are reasonably confident we can handle it.
Religiously, India, Buddhism is their major religion, as far as I know. And it is a religion which emanated out of our country.
Mm.
And, India has not been able to probably capitalize on the strength of Buddhism, uh, unlike, many other nations which do try and capitalize upon their religious, kind of affiliations. You think that such diplomatic steps can also help, though it's a very, very far-stretched idea, but do
No,
you
no,
think?
no. It is a crucial idea not only for China, for Sri Lanka. Right across our western neighborhood, there are millions, in the hundreds of millions of Buddhists, and and we India has is the home of Gautama Buddha. The holiest shrines of Buddhism are in India, and yet one of the most, in my view, one of the most serious failures in Indian policy ever since independence is we have not been able to exploit Buddhism's advantages. The fact of the matter is that Lord Buddha lived here. It spread across Asia, uh, and it's really towards our east. If you travel from anywhere from Myanmar to Japan, Buddhism holds the sway. Even China, and China worries about that. It's Buddhist, large numbers, in a couple of 100 million. And I think unless we work with with our eastern neighbors and include Sri Lanka, you can have a beautiful tourism circuit which would link India, Sri Lanka, with the rest of Southeast Asia, um, because they are devout Buddhists. Um, Coming to Bodh Gaya would be salvation, but let's not also forget that the first country it spread to during the time of Emperor Ashoka here was Sri Lanka. And the what I call as Buddhist diplomacy is I hope something the government will take on. One has given it a try. We have a good policy, but we can make ourselves much more central to the development of Southeast Asia and really challenge communist China by making India perhaps joined with Sri Lanka and Myanmar as the hub of Buddhist tourism.
So all this has not happened overnight. All this
No,
has not happened overnight. Now,
I have been pushing this with the government of India since the days I was in Myanmar. I'm afraid I have not succeeded, but we do have a group of us who are pushing this. That look, Christianity spread in a certain way. The entire Abrahamic religions, whether it's Christianity, Islam, or other faiths there from our West, they have spread. But a religion which emerged in India well before Islam has has not spread. India, most people don't even recognize, if you go to any of these Southeast Asian countries, that Lord Buddha was born in India, lived in India, and was Indian for all purposes. Though the Nepalese certainly have a share because Lumbini is placed. So you can have a Buddhist circuit of South Asia, which comprise Sri Lanka, India, Nepal, and Myanmar. And I tell you, it may take
Myanmar, sir, if I am not wrong, Myanmar is are primarily Arakanas, ethnically Arakanas, who are Muslims. They are not Buddhists.
they are 90% Buddhist. What are you talking about? 95%, and very devout Buddhists.
Sir,
Therefore, the Myanmar.
what is the reaction to this Sri Lankan crisis? Because it's not only about India, China, and Sri Lanka.
Mm. Well, I think what has happened is the Chinese feel unsettled. The Americans are talking a lot and doing precious little. And we are really looking for the World Bank and IMF to help out. So, yeah, China has ambitions. America now wants everything to be done in the name of the Quad. But when it comes to dishing out money for projects, we'll have, I guess, you have to use the World Bank route.
Has China been able to, according to your knowledge, is also Maldivian, Maldivian situation very different from, though that's not the subject we are discussing today, but it's a common territory. Sri Lanka shares its boundaries with both India and, Maldives. So as far as Maldives is concerned, does China have similar policies as like
Yes,
this?
China has a highly competitive policy, but they have a problem. Maldives is Islamic, and therefore they look towards West Asia, but also they look to India. I recall when I was working with the Prime Minister in the 1980s, when Maldives was taken over by a bunch of almost pirates from Sri Lanka. We moved the army, airlifted an entire army battalions virtually in a single day to end the takeover, and we restored Maldivian sovereignty. And therefore, with Maldives, we have a pretty old association. But yes, uh, the uh, Gotabaya Rajapaksa went there. I don't think the Maldives wanted to get involved in this because Maldives have a lot of close ties with Sri Lanka across the Indian Ocean. Closest port, shipping, various other things. So he's now gone to Singapore, and I'm not sure who is going to welcome Gotabaya long term because if he goes back, he's almost certain he will face a judicial process. And also, the Tamils in Sri Lanka have not forgotten that the military operations against them were carried out by Gotabaya, who is for ex-army and also has been the defense secretary.
Militarily, you have been also a defense man. You are one of the soldiers of the 1965 war, if I correctly remember. And militarily, 7,500 odd kilometers of coastline.
Mm.
And Bangladesh, for example, is a nation which probably the BSF takes care. Sri Lanka, militarily, what do you suggest? We need to be very careful now.
No, they will be. Look, the fact of the matter is they got enamored by Chinese aid. And now they have had to hand over the Hambantota port to China. Not a very wise decision, or being forced into those circumstances. So I think they will be more careful about the sort of debt they get into with China and the sort of viability of the projects. Uh, but China is, for example, has been sulking for some time, ever since we signed that contract on Colombo port, and uh, this will continue because China sees this route across the Indian Ocean, Sri Lanka, having its place for ships passing through from the Straits of Malacca to the Straits of Hormuz.
You've seen this. We'll be finishing in 5 minutes time. You've seen this Sri Lankan landscape from the closest possible quarters. I mean, they are, Indians. We share a history with them, thousands of years of history, mythologically or whatever way you may call it. We share a history with them. Why could not we take advantage? Because over the last 10 years also of the current government, I'm not saying, I'm not casting aspersions on the what do you call alacrity of the government's external affairs policies. But today, when China was making inroads into this Sri Lankan territory, economically or otherwise, why were we not able to take or make similar decisions, especially when we had a very good relationship with their political dispensation as well?
Let's be very, very clear. China has perhaps the best and most efficient construction industry in the world. If you travel to China and see the construction work, it's incredible. And they are making their money and, in fact, taking control not only of Sri Lanka, but we were worrying about Maldives and many parts of the East African coast by getting people into excessive debt and then taking over the project area. That's happened in the along the East African coast. Don't we should not underestimate China. And let us also be very clear. In economic times, they're 7 times our size, or 5 times our size. So uh, we have to have, and that's why the partnership with Japan is vital. And unfortunately, the person who initiated it, Shinzo Abe, died recently. But we are confident that the present government will continue this. But you know, uh, it's all very nice to be very brave and think we can take on the whole world on our own. But diplomacy is all about having partners to work.
Almost 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 25, 27 years of civil war crisis in Sri Lanka. uh, you know would you would you point out a few important, there were a lot of questions raised from the atrocities by the forces in Sri Lanka and Indian forces as well. So would you probably point out a few things which could have been done better by us in hindsight?
In hindsight, you are always wiser because you are not aware of what were the diverse pressures pushing you. We got involved because MGR was close to the LTTE, and MGR was in a coalition with New Delhi. The DMK was close to another group called the Tello, Karunanidhi. But the moment MGR disappeared from the scene, Karunanidhi took over, uh, being the champion of the LTTE. So that's India's internal politics, and you have to learn to live with it because obviously when refugees kept flowing into Tamil Nadu from Sri Lanka, the people in Tamil Nadu were justifiably angry, and therefore the successive prime ministers, both Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi and Narasimha Rao for some time, did have to deal with this in a different manner.
I wanted to rake this up because now there has been a very important change in the political dispensation here in Tamil Nadu in India. And how do you think it impacts the future going forward? Because still we have got 5% Indian Tamils in Sri Lanka.
No, the Indian Tamils now, for example, both governments, Manmohan Singh and the present government, the really backward people were not the Sri Lankan Tamil from Jaffna, but the Indian Tamils who went there in the 19th century as farm labor and other labor, basically. They remained economically backward. We've gone in for a massive housing program for them over the last 4 or 5 years, which has helped. I mean, and also for rehabilitation of Tamils during the conflict. Government of India chipped in with a lot of money. It was largely during Dr. Manmohan Singh's time.
And areas of cooperation in the immediate future?
Well, areas of cooperation was to be how to work with the rest of the world in getting Sri Lanka's economy back in place. After all, the mismanagement which the Rajapaksa government has done is not easy. I mean, they refuse to use fertilizer. How do you expect agricultural production to grow? Um, and therefore, these mistakes have to be set right, and we should help Sri Lanka to come back to stand on its own feet. Right now, it's chaos.
The current Honorable MEA worked with you as your team member as a deputy secretary decades back, if I correctly remember.
No, no. If he was
Just
in Colombo and I was in Delhi, he was
no,
first
no.
secretary of Colombo.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, he worked with you as your deputy secretary in one of your assignments. Probably you were ambassador in to Pakistan or some country at that time. I don't remember exactly, but your suggestions to the, because this is going to be important from a foreign policy perspective. Your suggestions, say 5 important suggestions for the government of India, considering the very important Sri Lankan crisis.
I would not presume to advise the government of India. I think between the Prime Minister and Jai Shankar, they're doing a great job. The security aspects are being looked well after by Ajit Doval. They know what they're doing. I mean, so I have a certain empathy with the Sri Lankans, and I have for the last 5 or 6 years been a member of the India Sri Lanka Intergovernmental Foundation, which works on projects to bring, you know, studies, people from Sri Lanka coming here to institutions, that sort of human exchanges, spreading it. But I would still like to see better improved tourism for facilities for Buddhist tourists from Sri Lanka. Uh, that is that is one thing which we have missed out. Our strongest strength is Lord Buddha, and we have not used it to our full advantage.
And I never
I
thought I was raising up such an important issue. I never thought when I said, oh, God, Buddha, that
Yeah,
religion issue is such an important one.
it is. It is. They are very devout Buddhists, very devout, and there are different varieties of it, Mahayana, Hinayana, and so on. Whether in Southeast Asia and in the subcontinent, but boy, it is. They are devout, and we, as I say, I think we've wasted 70 years of our independence in not using the Buddhist leverage, the Buddhist heritage of this country to maximum advantage.
So I think India needs to thank you so much for your time today. I'm sure this will be used by the policymakers to probably, dissect the Sri Lankan crisis in a constructive manner, so that going forward, this so-called teardrop nation, this crisis doesn't, catapult this teardrop nation, into a full-blown cause for worry and tears for the country like India. We need to be.
They'll take about 3 years to recover.
Thank you, sir. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you. Jai Hind.
Jai Hind.